We began last week on Daf Samach Tes Amud Aleph with a Gemara that begins with the words Yosef Rabbi Yaakov Minar Pekod. So if you have the standard editions of the Shas, you can count down from the wide lines 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down. And the first word in the line is going to be Chadashim, or really Chadashim. What I'd like to do is begin tonight with a little bit of an overview, highlighting some of the points of this Gemara so that we don't have to tediously go through necessarily word by word. But it's very important to get the names straight. You know, who's saying what to whom. That's not always the case. But in this case, it's very important. Rabbi Yaakov is quoting Rav Huna. And basically, Rav Huna is going to come up with a theory. And that theory is based on a logical analysis. So let's see what that theory is all about. In the previous Gemara, before this one, we had a statement of Rav Krus Bedoy, and his opinion was that from the time that a young lad enters into the candidacy to become a Ben Sorah Morer, and after he's guilty of Zol V'Sove, we put him to death with Skila. That time is Shtei Saros, and it lasts for 3 months, max. There's no way that it could be more than 3 months. And the reason for that is because of a halachic concept called Roy Likoris Ben, that he could become a father. I'm sorry, Roy Likori Av, I meant to say. Now, what does that mean? He could become a father. He cannot really become a father in 3 months after Shtei Saros. That's impossible. But he could be Roy Likori Av, which means that in a pure theoretical sense, he could have a relationship with a woman and impregnate her immediately after Shtei Saros. And people will call him, quote unquote, Av, as soon as we get to the state of Hukar HaUbar, which means that she's showing. And now the question is the following. To define exactly when it's Hukar HaUbar, there are 2 possible definitions. One is 3 months, period. There's no ifs, ands, or buts, no exceptions. It's a flat, absolute rule. The other way of defining Hukar Ubar is 1/3 of the term of pregnancy from conception until birth. Now, in a normal full-term birth of 9 months, 1/3 equals 3 months. But the Gemara works with the assumption that if a woman does not carry to the full term, but rather gives birth prematurely at 7 months, then the possibility arises that if Hukar Ubar is 1/3 of the time period, the time zone from X, from conception till Y, till birth, then in the case of a preemie, that would be a shorter period of time. We're going to take that period of time and divide it by 3. And the Gemara says that that's going to lead to 2 months and a third, 2 1/3 months. comes along Rav Huna, as presented here by Rabbi Yaakov from Kodnar, and Rav Huna presents the following thesis. The very fact that Rav Kruspedoi gives a 3-month time slot for candidacy to be a Ben Tzora Morer, it must be, it cannot be otherwise, that he took the path that is an absolute 3-month period of Hukara Ubar. And only after 3 months pass by, from the moment that this young lad exhibits Shtei Saros, only after those 3 months would it be possible for this young lad to become royally Karis Av. And here's the logical analysis of Rav Huna. If Rav Kruspedoi would have assumed that Hukara Ubar always equals 1/3 of the time period from conception to birth, then in the case of a premature baby, we come up with 2 months and a third. And if that be the case, then the standard for the candidacy period of a Ben Tzora Morer would have to be reduced to 2 months and a third. And why is that? Because we have to consider the possibility that the Ben, after impregnating a woman, if she'll give birth prematurely, then he's already royally Kari Av, meaning this Hukara Ubar, already after 2 months and a third. And Rav Kruspedoi says, no, we're going to give another 2/3 of a month of that period of candidacy for the Chiyuv Skila of Ben Tzora Morer. It must be, therefore, argues Rav Huna, that in the mindset of Rav Kruspedoi, the time period of Hukara Ubar is set and is absolute, regardless of whether she carries through a full term of 9 months or 7 months premature. It's always set at 3 months. Because again, just to go over one more time the logic and the analysis of Rav Huna, if you were to grant that in the case of a premature birth, Hukara Ubar is reached at 2 months and a third, which would be 1/3 of the term, then Rav Kruspedoi should reduce that time slot of candidacy of a Ben Tzora Morer from 3 months down to 2 months and a third, considering the possibility that already, because everything is theoretical in any event, the theoretical possibility that this young lad would be royally Karas Av already after 2 months and a third. And if Rav Kruspedoi gives that extra 2/3 of a month of candidacy for the Chiyuv Skila of a Ben Tzora Morer who's guilty of Zol V'Sove, it must mean by definition that he's operating with the premise that Hukara Ubar is always the absolute, unconditional, non-relative, objective standard of 3 months. And this thesis of Rav Huna, which sounds so attractive and so analytical, was presented to Ravina. And Ravina said, no, you're making a mistake. It could very well be that Rav Kruspedoi understands and accepts that it's always a third of the term, and it's relative. It's not objectively absolute, 3 months, but in the case of a premature birth, it would be 2 months and a third. And then you'll ask me, so why should we put the Ben Tzora Morer to death, even, let's say, 2.5 months after his Shtei Saros? After all, it could be that he's already royally Karis Av. And the answer is, in the language of Ravina, Azlinan Basaruba, the halacha operates within the framework of rov. We had a discussion last week. What exactly is the rov over here? Is it 90%? Is it more than 90%? Less than 90%? What was it at the time of Chazal? How many women out of the general population of women giving birth will give birth prematurely? But whatever it is, whatever your statistical analysis will arrive at, whatever number, it's always going to be rov that she will not give birth prematurely, but give birth full term. And therefore, according to Ravina, we will establish the standard and the time period for potential ben sorah mora, which means a chiyuv skila, based on rov. And since rov women, one will reach hukar ha'ibur 1/3 of the 9-month period of time, granting that most women give birth to after a full term of 9 months. Therefore, that will set up the standard for ben sorah mora. And that means, as I said before, that if the ben sorah mora would become guilty and condemned for zol v'soveh 2.5 months after having reached the level of gadlus by exhibiting shtei saros, then we're going to put him to death. What do you mean put him to death? How can you put him to death? And here's where Rav Huna comes back into the boxing ring with a very strong punch against Ravina. And he says, okay, it's very nice that the Torah relies on rov, but to kill a person? Are you going to put someone to death based on rov? After all, the Torah says, v'itzilu ha'eda, and that is a mandate to the judges sitting on a bezdin of 23 judges in a capital case to find, search, and bend their backs over and over to try to come up with a way of letting the accused off the hook, of vindicating the accused criminal, v'itzilu ha'eda. If, for example, he did an action of Chilul Shabbos, lidugma, then try as hard as he can to determine that perhaps he did it b'shogeg. He was unaware that it was Shabbos. He was unaware of the malacha. And therefore, we're not going to use rov and rely on rov to kill a person. We are mandated by the Torah under the law of v'itzilu ha'eda to protect the accused and try as hard as we can to vindicate the accused. And now you're going to base on rov, and you put this young man to death 2.5 months after he exhibits shtei saros based on rov, when perhaps he's already mufka, he's already excluded from the parsha ben sorah morer, simply because he's royally karis av, if on a 10% chance the woman that he impregnated would give birth after 7 months, and hukar ha'uba was achieved already after 2 1/3 months. And now you're going to put him to death because you're not going to consider the possibility that he was royally karis av after 2 1/3 months, basing yourself on rov, and the Torah says v'itzilu ha'eda. At this point, the ball is back into the court of Ravina. And Ravina is going to tell you that I have a Mishnah in Masechet Sanhedrin that's going to prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that we can put a person to death based on rov. And the entire sugya here on Daf Samach Tes reveals an attempt and another attempt and another attempt on the part of Ravina to prove that the Torah will condemn someone to death based on rov. And then we have to come back to v'itzilu ha'eda and assume that Itzilu Ve'eda applies only within the strict limitations of determining whether the criminal was guilty of a deliberate crime intentionally or unintentionally. And until we're absolutely convinced that he was deliberate, then Vitzilu Ve'eda, maybe he was a shogeg. But beyond that, we will rely on Rov, and we could condemn the accused to death based on Rov. How does Ravina prove that? The Mishnah tells us in Masechet Sanhedrin on Daf Mem that if there's a discrepancy with regard to Eidim who are testifying in a murder case, in a capital crime case, and the discrepancy between the two Eidim is 1 full day on the Jewish calendar, which means that we have to investigate the Eidim. They must answer the question, when was this crime committed? If they can't answer that question, the Eidus is out the window, totally unaccepted. And the Mishnah says that if there's a discrepancy between the two Eidim of 1 single day, for example, one Eid says that the crime took place on the 2nd day of Shvat, and another witness says, no, the crime took place on the 3rd day of Shvat. We will assume, based on Rov, that they are both giving the same identical answer to the question, when was the crime committed, just that one of them was mistaken about the Hebrew calendar. The Hebrew calendar is a little bit more complicated because it's a lunar calendar. And as you know, there's what's called a Chodesh Chaser, and there's a Chodesh Me'ubar, or Mullet, which means that the month could have 29 days in it, a Chaser, or 30 days, a Mullet. Now, if you turn the clock back to the old days, we didn't have the calendar of Hillel HaSheni, we had Kiddush Al Pi Re'iyah. So the Beis Din HaGadol had to accept Eidim, and then based on the testimony of Eidim, who witnessed, according to their testimony, the Levana B'Chidusha, Beis Din would declare whether the month is Me'ubar or Chaser. They would say Mekudesh Mekudash and sanctify Rosh Chodesh. The word didn't get out. There were a limited number of people who knew about it early in the month, and most of the people didn't even know about it. So this fellow, who may have mistakenly identified that calendar day as the 3rd day of the month, was unaware of the fact that Beis Din had determined that the previous month was Chaser or Mullet. So one of the two Eidim is off by a day. We will combine the two Eidim together. We will nullify what we call Hakchasha, and by reconciling these two Eidim, granting that one of them belongs to the Rov and made a mistake about the calendar date by 1 day, we will put the accused to death. Says Ravina, I now have proof positive that the Torah relies on Rov to put a person to death. There's no doubt that there's a minority of cases in which both Eidim knew exactly when Rosh Chodesh was. And there really is a discrepancy between this Eid and the other Eid. But we're not going to even entertain the idea of a mute, of maybe that's what happened. We're going to totally rely on the Rov. And in the Gemara's language, the Gemara says, Mishum da'amrinan zil basaruba, v'ruba de inshi avdi de to bi bura diarche. Most of the people will make a mistake about the Ibur HaChodesh. Now, before we go on, we want to understand the Ran's problem. And if you have the Masifta, which I tried to get out a message, it's very helpful tonight to have the Masifta. You can look on page Samach Tes, Amud Aleph, number Gimel in brackets, footnote number Yud Zayin. I'll wait a few seconds if you want to just turn to the right page. I just want to welcome a good friend of mine who's here from Canada, Byron Shore. Hi, Byron. Nice to see you. Hikshar Ran. The Ran is perplexed about the fact that there could be a discussion, a debate here between Rav Huna and Ravina. Do we rely on Rov to put someone to death? Do we not rely on Rov to put someone to death? In light of the sugya of Rov, the main sugya of Rov in all of Shas, which is in Chulin Daf Yud Aleph Amud Beis, the Gemara says there that we can only put a murderer to death if we rely on Rov. If we do not rely on Rov, then no murderer would ever be put to death, because there's always a miut of people who might have been, quote unquote, a treifa at the time that they were murdered. We're looking at the victim. Again, the Gemara is going to have a whole discussion about the permissibility of doing an autopsy, not doing an autopsy. But the Gemara finally concludes that even if you were to do an autopsy and the determination of the cause of death was the sword that Ruvain pierced into the heart of Shimon after getting Asra and in the presence of two Eidim, we still would not be able to be certain that Shimon was killed as a healthy person, as a Bar Kayama. It's still possible. We don't know exactly statistically what percentage, but there is a myriad of people, as the Gemara calls it, the b'makom sayif nekev havi. Exactly where the sword penetrated into the vital organ of the victim had an inner injury to that organ. His days were numbered. He has the status of a treifa. And a horig is a treifa pot. Gemara says, we don't have to consider the possibility that the victim was on his last legs, so to speak, last legs of life, and he was a treifa. No. We're going to rely on Rov. And based on that Rov, we assume that the victim was healthy, he was not a treifa, and therefore we'll put the murderer to death. Says the Ran. Clearly, the Torah relies on Rov. Even in Dinei Nefashos, to condemn a person to death, we will rely on Rov. So what, asks the Ran, is all this hullabaloo here? A debate between Rav Huna and Ravina. Yes, no, maybe. Can we put someone to death based on Rov? Can we not? This is the famous sugi of Rov. It's impossible that Ravina and Rav Huna were oblivious. Now, this question is difficult. Bein l'Rav Huna, bein l'Ravina. According to Rav Huna, we don't understand how he questions the premise that we put someone to death based on Rov. We do that in the case of Ritzicha. The question is equally challenging in the case of Ravina, who stands on his head to do a somersault, to quote a Mishnah, which very complicated Mishnah about two Eidim, and there's discrepancy of one day, and here the Ravina found his place to prove that we rely on Rov. Why not invoke the principle of Rov as it is established by the Gemara in Chulin, which means that we will put the murderer to death based on Rov. And by the way, the Gemara gives another proof over there in Chulin that we base on Rov, and we can kill a person. In the case of Makeh Aviv, a person who wounds his father deliberately will be put to death. How do we know it's his father? And the answer is Rov be'ilo sachar abal. We don't have genetic testing, so we have Rov be'ilo sachar abal. And that gives us the likelihood that this is his father, and therefore we're going to put him to death for injuring his father. Same thing with Makal Aviv. And it's all based on Rov. So why do we have to work so hard? And Rav Huna is the skeptic from the get-go. And Ravina is the one who's working overtime to try to establish that we rely on Rov to put someone to death. Asks the Ran, the Torah says, put the Rotzeach to death. Af sheyesh lachshosh shema nirtzach haya treifa. There is a possibility, as unlikely as it may seem, that the nirtzach is a treifa. Ubein kovacho lo hayachol lichos. Even if he hadn't been murdered, he would have died on his own. V'yein chayov misal harigos treifa. Al koch sholchim min hatorach harov afilu b'dinei nefashos. V'im kain eich donu kana moroim im holchem achar harov b'dinei nefashos. O lo holchem achar harov. What was the discussion? What was the debate? Vitirates, the Ran offers his answer. Shagamara sham ochicha sholchem acharov b'davar she'ein efsharis klal levaroso. V'im lo nelech acharov lo tia mitzius shalarigas harotzeach. It would be a contradiction between two premises if we assume both of them to be true simultaneously. Premise number one, that we put a murderer to death. Premise number two, that we don't rely on Rov. And we cannot put anyone to death based on Rov. Those two premises are mutually exclusive because there's no way that you could put to death a murderer without relying on Rov. Because we always have the possibility that the victim was what? A treifa. Okay. In such a case, the Torah says, put the murderer to death, and we have no other choice but to assume Rov. And we're going to rely on Rov to put the condemned to death. In my Torah, Omer shahorgen esortzech al karchach yeshel yesh lismach al Rov b'nei Adam sheinam treifa. Aval hamoroim nechleku kan b'ofen she'efshel l'kayim es hadin shal harigas ben soru morer gam b'li lo leches achar Rov. Rav Huna's problem is, why not reduce the term and the time period of candidacy to put the Ben Sorah Morah to death from 3 months to 2 1/3 months, and we have a perfectly acceptable solution to the problem why the Torah and when the Torah says put the Ben Sorah Morah to death. So if I understand the Ran correctly, then the Ran is coming up with a technical answer to his question. Enochinami. The Ran admits even in his answer that from the case of Rotzeach, we do prove in an absolute way that the Torah relies on Rov, even in Dinei Nefashos. However, maybe that's only because there's no other choice. It's the Efshel Avarer. There's no Efsharut Birur except to rely on Rov. But here, we don't have to rely on Rov. The Torah says put the Ben Sorah Morah to death only after sealing 2 months and 1/3. Because the Torah takes into consideration, argues Rav Huna, the miut of a premature birth, and therefore a hukara uber of 2 months and 1/3. So it's not like we have no choice over here. We can have a cake and eat it. We can, on the one hand, accept the premise that we will put the Ben Sorah Morah to death, but on the other hand, we're not going to put him to death based on Rov. We're going to have to be absolutely sure and certain beyond a doubt that when he committed the crime of Zolel V'Sove, he was lo roy likares av. Because even if in that unusual case of a premature birth, nevertheless, within the first period of 2 months and a third, he was certainly not roy likares av. Even if you consider the possibility of that minority of premature birth. That's where Rav Huna stands up and he objects to Ravina. And Ravina would say the following: well, okay, there's a discrepancy between two witnesses of one day. You know, you could argue, Rav Huna, that in such a case we can't put the accused to death because there's no real clear answer to the case, to the question of a date. When exactly did the crime, was it committed? But if there's no discrepancy between the two Eidim, and they both say it took place on the 3rd of Shvat, for example, then we will be Mekayim the parsha and put the condemned to death. So why do we put the condemned to death when there's a discrepancy of a day? It must be that we're going to rely on Rov to put someone to death. Adkan Haran. The suggestion of an alternative answer to the Ran's question without entering into this technicality of it's efshar or e-efshar would be to suggest the following. The Gemara in Chulin, in the case of Rotseach, relying on the rov that the Nirtzach was healthy, would not be ample proof to establish Ravina's conclusion with regard to Ben Soromor. True, there's no question that we could prove that this Nirtzach belongs to the Rov. And the Rov are healthy, and he was murdered. He was not a treifa. The Rov could clarify that reality, that metzius of the victim who is now being interred. He was not a treifa when he was murdered. That power of Rov, I grant you, and even Rav Huna would grant you. And that's the Sugyan Hu. But here we're dealing with a whole different set of circumstances. We're trying to set the standards here in the halacha for a concept called Roy Likares Av. We are now establishing not a specific case of Ben Soromor, and maybe there never was a Ben Soromor, but rather we're establishing regulations and standards. We're being kovea what is the time period within which a young lad is a candidate for becoming a Ben Soromor. This is not an issue of clarifying the mitzius. This is an issue of clarifying the legal status and definition of Roy Likares Av. And for that, when we look into the Torah and we try to figure out what would be the standard for the Torah, we should rely on Rov. Rav Huda says, I can't tolerate that. The standards of the Torah should consider all possible scenarios, including the miut, and therefore, once this lad has passed the 2 months and a third, he's already Roy Likares Av, albeit in the minority cases. How can we set up a standard that will apply to every possible scenario of a Ben Sorer or Morer from the Torah and Har Sinai until the very end of time based on Rov? That's not how the Torah is going to operate. The Torah will rely on Rov in a specific case. You have Nebuchadnezzar, a victim of murder in front of you. You want to determine whether he was a treif or not, rely on Rov. Rov is going to be mafar the mitzias of this particular deceased or murdered. Was he a treifa? No. We're going to go basarov. But therefore, to make the leap of faith that the Torah will rely on rov in order to set the standards for all of Ben Sora Morris from now until Olam Haba, who says that the Torah would rely on rov? You have two choices. You have a woman who carries full term and hukar uber is after 3 months. You have a woman who gives birth prematurely, and according to this tzad, hukar uber is after 2 months and a third. Why not use the premature birth as your standard? Because now the Torah says vitzilu ha'eda, and we should take that standard that will seriously restrict the period of time in which a Ben Sora Mora qualifies as such and will be put to death. That's Rav Huna. Now the question is, what did Ravina prove from the Sugya in Sanhedrin Daf Mem in the case where there was a discrepancy between the two witnesses? Are we not dealing with this mitzius in front of us of Reuven and Shimon, not brothers, who came to testify? Reuven said it was on the 2nd of Shvat, and Shimon on the 3rd of Shvat, and now we determined that one of them was mistaken in Ibra Chodesh. Isn't that therefore a case where we are determining the mitzius in one particular case? And if that be the case, then that's not an argument against Rav Huna. Rav Huna knew very well the Sugya in Chulin and the halacha that we put the Rotzeach to death, and we are mavar the mitzias of this particular victim. And here, likewise, we will mavar the mitzias of this particular aid and this testimony that it was based on a missing piece of information. So what then was Ravina's proof? And let's try to use a model to shed a light on Ravina. We have a halacha called toch kedei dibur. What does that mean? We allow a person who makes a statement or a declaration or a commitment a certain period of time, very short period of time, to either clarify what he said, perhaps add a condition to what he said, or even to change what he said, to make a non-A into an A, or vice versa. These are standards that apply to everyone. So, for example, if a witness says that the mechira was at the price of 100, and then toch kedei dibur he changes his mind, changes the story, and it was 200, or the mechira didn't take place at all, or there was a condition in the mechira. In all those cases, we give a person that leeway, and that's the standard of a mistake. That a person says, I made a boo-boo, I made a mistake, I wish I hadn't said what I said, and we give him a certain excuse me, what should we say, give him a leash, give him a little bit of a margin of error to tell us he made a mistake. That's not a question of any individual. That's a standard. That's a halacha. That's a legal statement that applies in every situation for every person. That in the Nimshal is what's going on here in Ravina. Ravina is saying that we need a margin of error when it comes to defining the day of the crime. And why do we allow for this margin of error? We allow for it because of the Torah's system of determining the day of the month, which allows for a rove of very serious possibility, call it a probability, that a person will be off by 1 day. He never got the word. He doesn't know that this is really the 2nd of Shvat. He thinks it's the third of Shvat. We give him that margin of error. And this will apply as a standard throughout all of Hilchas Eidus. Whenever you have two witnesses testifying and there's a discrepancy of a day, there is no discrepancy. And why not? How do we reconcile that discrepancy? And the answer is Rov. The Rov stands up and says he made a boo-boo, he made a mistake, he was off by a day. Give him that leeway. Give him the leash. And therefore, we can reconcile the two Eidim. How do we set that standard? Says Ravina, we set that standard based on Rov. The language of Ravina is the Amrina Zil Basaruba, Varuba de Inshi, Avidi de Tobi, Bura de Archa. Says Ravina, now I have a perfect analogy to the case of Ben Sorah Morah. Yes, Enochinami, it's always going to be a third. And in a case of a woman who gave birth prematurely, the hukar uber is 2 months and a third. But the Torah sets the standards for Ben Sorah Morah based on Rov. And where do you see, by analogy, that the Torah sets the standards in Dini Nefashos based on Rov in the case of two witnesses, and we will reconcile their seeming contradiction based on Rov. And that sets up a standard in halacha that goes across the board. But now we get to the next piece of Gemara. Ravina again makes an attempt at proving that the Torah relies on Rov even to the extent of putting someone to death. So let's see if we're all on the same page. We're up to Omar Rabbi Yirmiyah Midifti. Afanan Nami Tnina. Let's count up from the end of Samates Amadav. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Do we all have it? The first word in the line is Avdi. Amar Rav Yirmiyah Midifti. Afanan Nami Tnina. I will also prove and support Ravina that the Torah relies on Rov to put a person to death, based on a Mishnah in Masechet Nida on Daf Mem Daladam and Beis. And now we're talking about a young girl who's a Bas Shalosh Shana V'Yom Echad. It means that she's Re'uya L'Bia, and her father received Kiddushin on her behalf, which is a Doraisa law. Espiti Nasati Lishazeh. Miskadeshes B'Bia. If the father accepted Kesef or Shtar, fine. But not only that, there's a third method of Kiddushay Torah, and that's Kiddushay Bia. And she's Re'uya L'Bia. To what extent is she an Eishes Ish? The Mishnah establishes that in Baal Yavam, let's say her husband died, childless, he had no zera, he left a brother, and now his brother, the Yavam, has a relationship with her, then she becomes a full-fledged Eishes Ish through the Parsha of Yibum. And that means that if she dies, he will inherit her. He's allowed to bury her even if he's a Kohen and be Metamila. And to allow her to get married to another man, she must receive a get. Again, the get will be delivered to her father because she's still very young. This is where you want to underline it. We're going to put someone to death if he has a relationship with this 3-year-old girl. Again, it's kind of shocking when you think about it, that a 3-year-old girl, 3 years and a day, could be married. And not only can she be married, her marriage is absolutely legal and binding like any other marriage. Again, Rabbi say in today's society, anything goes. You know, the definitions of marriage have changed radically. But I was talking about the old-fashioned days, you know, when I was a kid, you know, where a man married a woman. You follow what I'm saying? Okay, we don't have to get into this. But so she was 3 years and a day. Her father received Kiddushin for her. and now another man has a relationship with her. The Mishnah Paskins, Chayovin Olem Mishumeshes Ish. We will put the Boel to death. She doesn't get the electric chair because she's only 3 years old, but he will be killed. Umetami is Boel. And if she's a Nida, because a girl could be a Nida from the day she's born, and someone, in this case the Baal, presumably, had a beer with her, then we have a special category called Tumas Boel Es Hanida. That's a parsha in the Torah, and the Torah says that he who has Be'ilo with a Nida is Tameh, a very, very intense and severe level of Tumah that he contracts, L'Tameh Mishkav Tachton Ke'elyon, which means, and we'll just go through the Masifti here. If you have the Masifti, says, Sheme'ata Kol Beged Shehu Yishkav Olav. This Boel Asanida, if he lies on top of a garment or a sheet or a blanket, the Gamlo Yirgav, he didn't even have any physical contact with the blanket. Habeged Tomeh. That's called Litame Mishkav Hatachton Ke'elyon. Ke'elyon Shel Zav. And why does he mention Zav? Klomar Kmo Beged Shenisa Al Gabi Zav. With regard to Zav, there's a special halacha that if a beged is on top of the Zav, then that beged contracts a tumah, which is called a Rishon L'Tumah, and it's Mitami Ochlunu Mashkin. V'upazeh Shona Tumas Boel Nida Mitumas Hanida Atzma. We have a case of Tumas Nida, and a Tumas Nida is not on the same level as a Boel Nida. In the case of a beged, Shanida Shocheves Alav Nasa Avatum Mitami Odom V'Kelim. But that's not so in the case of Boel Nida. But we go on in the Mishnah says that this Ketana is married to a Kohen, she's a Bas Yisrael, Ocheles B'Truma. Now, a Bas Yisrael is not allowed to eat Truma unless she has a full-fledged kinyan of Eishes Ish to a Kohen. On a Deraisa level, even Erison is enough. If, let's say, she has a relationship with those who passel her to be married to a Kohen, for example, a guy, a Cholol, a Nosin, all right, Nosin might be the Rabbanan, or Mamzer, is Psolim and Akahuna. Any of the above, if they have a relationship with her, she can no longer marry a Kohen. Why? Because she's Re'uil Abiyah from the age of 3 and 1 day. And if any of the arayas have a relation with a bas gimel, even if she is not married, so let's say, for example, she would have a relationship with her father, then her father would be put to death. And now we turn to Daf Samach Tes Amud Beis. The Amai, how could we possibly put a person to death because of the Isha's relationship when her father accepted her Kedushin at the ripe old age of 3 years old? She was 3 years old. Do we know if she'll be an islandess? Ema islandess he. Now we can only know whether a girl is an islandess or not at the age of 20. But certainly from the age of 3 up to the age of 20, we don't know. She may in fact be an islandess. So Amai, if you take a look at the third line down from the top in the Masifta here on Daf Samach Tes Amud Beis, Madua Bo Lechayv Misa. Ema islandess he. Now if, as fate would be unfolded, we could find out that this girl is an islandess, then the marriage relationship is what we call Kedushei Tos. Vadaiti dehachi lo kiddush. So now you're going to put a person to death for having a relationship with a 3-year-old girl who was married off by her father, and maybe she's an islandess. Elalav, we have no choice. We have to conclude, says Rabbi Yirmiyah, am I right? Just to make sure I got the name right. Yeah, Rabbi Yirmiyah says that what? That Azlina Basa Ruba. The Rov Noshim Lav Island is new. Most women are not islanders. Now let's take a break for a moment and analyze this proof of Rabbi Yirmiyah. The Gemara now is going to embark on a very long pilpul, a discussion, dialectic. Is this Mishnah really proof? When the Mishnah says mumasim aleh, does it mean really that we put the boil to death? Maybe it means that the boil is chayiv to bring a carbon. Again, there's going to be a whole to-do here about whether or not there's ample proof to establish that we rely on rov and put the boil to death. But right now, for our purposes, let's assume that Rabbi Yirmiyah's argument is going to be accepted. So let's analyze this proof invoked by Rabbi Yirmiyah from the two perspectives that we offered to answer the Ran's kasha. The Ran himself said that we would never be able to put a murderer to death if we don't rely on rov. We need a case like Ben Sora Morer, where we're going to rely on rov despite the fact that we could still salvage the parsha and implement the parsha, even if we require certainty, absolute me'achuz fados. So we understand very well the case of Eidus. Ravina invoked a very strong proof against Rav Huna, because we can always establish the parsha of Eidus in a case where there is no discrepancy between the two Eidus. What would the Ran say about this Gemara, about Rabbi Yirmiyah? Can we ever put a person to death for having a bias erva or a bias eshes ish? And the answer is yes. She's not a katana. She's already a 20-year-old girl. She's already established simone gadlus. She's not even a candidate for islanders. Not every woman is a candidate for islanders. Every victim is a candidate for being a treifa. And Rav Huna is looking for a case where we rely on rov, even though we could certainly be comfortable about implementing the chiyuv misa in other cases where it's certain. And we had proof number one from the case of Eidus, when there's a discrepancy of one day. We could have fulfilled the parsha of Eidus in a case where there is no discrepancy. And now we have case number two, where we could fulfill the parsha of bias arayas and put to death the condemned criminal, because she is not in the parsha of islanders. She's not even a potential islanders. She's older than that. So the Ran is very good. But now let's analyze Rav Yirmiyah from the second perspective. That what Rav Huna is pressing here, and what he's demanding as a proof, in order to make an analogy to Ben Sora Morer, is some sort of a standard that will apply everywhere based on rov. No proof from the case of Ritzicha, because there it's a beer of this mitzius, of this nirtzach, to establish based on rov that he was a healthy person. That doesn't prove anything about Ben Sora Morer as to whether or not the standard that the Torah will apply would be the standard based on rov, meaning 3 months of Hubar Ukar, or the standard based on 2 months and a third. You can't prove anything from Ritzicha, because what we want to prove is that Torah establishes standards that will apply straight across the board to put a criminal to death based on rov. How do you know we can do that in the case of Ben Sarumo? In this case, where a man had a beer with a girl who was married off by her father, and she's still a young girl, she's 3 years and a day, and I'm going to put the boil to death. We need to clarify the reality of this particular girl. It's exactly similar from that perspective to the case of putting to death the murderer. So what does Rav Yirmiyah gain here by invoking this proof from Ba al-Bas Gimel Shana V'Yomechad Sheniskat Shel Yidei Aviyah? What is he proving? We're back to square one. We're back to the case of Rov as it applies to the victim of murder. As we say in Yiddish, ich schwitzt. I would like to mention the Ramban in Masechet Chulin. And the spin-off of that Ramban, I think, is the first Vilna Gaon in Yoredea. I'll read to you the Ramban at the beginning of Masechet Chulin. The Ramban says that after the Shechita, do we have to check the animal, what's called a bedika, an internal examination, to find out whether the animal was a treifa or not a treifa? Now, normally one could argue that if there's a suffix, then we have to do a suffix Isser, we have to do everything in our power, if we only have that potential, to clarify through B'dika whether everything is mutter. Like, for example, the Gemara says at the beginning of Psachim, you rent a house, you don't know if the maskir did B'dika. So the Gemara says, L'shayla, you have to check it out. Call him up and ask him if he did B'dika or not. Even though Rov will, what we call Chaverim, will do B'dika, but you can't rely on Rov. You don't rely on Rov. You have to do a B'dika. So the Ramban at the beginning of Chulin is famous for addressing the question of whether or not the Torah requires me, the Shochet, to do a B'dika after the Shechita to make sure that there were no punctures in any of the 18 vital organs in the animal's body. So the Ramban says the following. It all depends on what kind of rove you have. And the Ramban goes on to categorize rove into two separate categories. He says there's a rove with a miut matzui, I'll explain, and there's a rove she'ein miut matzui. Unfortunately, the Ramban doesn't break it down into statistical probability terms, but the poskim are going to work very hard to figure this out. If you have a miut matzui, then the Ramban says that because that miut is significant, let's call it 20%, then you have to do a bedika. You cannot rely on rove without implementing a bedika to clarify the reality. If on the other hand it's a miut she'ein matzui, let's say it's 90%, 95%, then you don't need a bedika. And the Vilna Gaon at the beginning of Yoredeus says the following. A man comes in from nowhere. You don't know who he is. You don't recognize him. And he picks up a chalif and he does shchita. The Gemara says, Rov mitzuyin etzel shchita mumchine. We did not test him. We don't know if he's an expert in shchita. We can rely on his shchita. Why? Because of Rov. And Rov mitzuyin etzel shchita mumchine. They're mumchin, they're experts. They know exactly how to do shchita in the proper way. So the Gaon says, do we have to take this person who implemented shchita, put him in front of a board? I don't mean a physical board. I mean a three people triumvirate, and test him and investigate him and find out if he's indeed a baki. Says the Gaon, we don't have to do so. No need for bedika, because the miyut is a miyut she'eino matzui. And the Gaon, without even mentioning the Ramban, is on the same wavelength as the Ramban. But what's it all about, Rabbosai? The Torah says rely on Rov. The Torah doesn't add another adjective and stipulate a condition that the Rov is a Rov without a miyut matzui. The Torah says rely on Rov. So you want to know whether I have to do a bedika or I don't have to do a bedika? That's a fascinating question. Maybe the Torah says don't rely on Rov when you can do a bedika. Maybe the Torah says rely on Rov and you don't need a bedika. But it's one or the other. You can't take Rov and divide it into two and say, you know what? There's a one Rov, one type of Rov, and there's another type of Rov. All Rovs are equal in the eyes of the Lord. So what is the Ramban talking about when he says, wait a minute, is it a Rov with a miyut matzui? No. It's a miyut she'eino matzui. You don't need a bedika. Rov with a miyut matzui, you have to rely on bedika. Put the Rov in back burners, back in the freezer. What are you talking about? What sense does the Ramban make when the Torah says to rely on Rov? I mean, it's possible the Torah says rely on Rov because you less brayer, you don't have a choice, and there's no possibility of bedika. But if that be the case, then even in the case of miyut she'eino matzui, even if you have a Rov of 95%, the Torah wants you to check it out and be vaday about it. So I have here a sefer. I'll just show it to you, show and tell. It's called Shiurei Harav Al Inyonei Shchita. And this is a transmission of the Torah of Rav Soloveitchik on Hilchos Shchita, put together by, I think I don't know if he still lives in the Gush, but he's certainly from the Gush, Rav Eli Krumein. And he writes the following in the name of Rav Soloveitchik. What is Rov? Sounds like a Shakespearean question. What is Rov? And the Rav offers two suggestions as to what is a Rov. What does a Rov accomplish? One suggestion, he calls it Hachroas HaSofek. Vasofek nisbarer al yidei Rov Vileka Sofek Kla. Do you hear this? And his second definition is Rov is something that we could fall back on. It's a nihug, but it's not a beer of the reality. There still is a suffix. Despite the Rov, the suffix still, how should I say, lurks in the shadows. It's inside the closet like a skeleton in the closet. Says Rav Soloveitchik, that's the difference between a miyut matzui and a miyut she'eino matzui. If there's a miyut she'eino matzui, let's call it 90%, then it's a birur. It clarifies and removes the suffix. But if it's a miyut hamatzui, let's call it 20%, then it's only a nihug. The Torah allows you to be lenient and fall back on rov, but the suffix is still like a mosquito in my ear. It's still buzzing. It's still active. The suffix is still alive and well. Narvas, the Torah says, rely on rov. The nafkamina is bedika. If you can clarify and remove the suffix, then you're obligated to do so. Well, if it's a miut she'eno matzui, the Ramban says you don't have to check it out. It's such a small percentage. That is a birur. The less suffix klal, or in the yeshiva world we call it a beis hasuffix or a leidas hasuffix. There's no leidas hasuffix. But if on the other hand, it's a miut matzui, then okay, the Torah says if you have no choice, your fallback position is rov. But if you can remove the suffix, because rov does not remove the suffix in the case of a miut matzui, then you're obligated to do the bedika. So let's now talk about the Mishnah Nida. A man has a relationship with a girl who's 3 years and 1 day old and was married off by a father. And now the Boel stands on trial. And we're going to rely on Rov. Rov says that she's not an islandess. I have a question for you. This is not a rhetorical question. I want an answer to this question. Is it possible to clarify the suffix and achieve through a bedika of sorts of ados? Anybody? You can unmute yourself, this is the drawback of Zoom, but...
Not until she's 20, right?
Exactly. David says it very well. Why don't we wait until she's 20 years old? Why are you putting him to death now when you have a possibility of clarifying it? And yet the Torah says, codified in the Mishnah Nida, that we put him to death immediately. And this girl is only 3 years and a day. And why do we put her to death? Why do we put him to death? Because of the rov that she's not an islandess. Well, go out and clarify the rov. Go out and clarify to make sure that with all certainty she's not an islandess. And be mavara the suffix until the suffix is no more. And wait until she's 20. And the answer, I believe, based on Rav Soloveitchik, would be that this rov is a rov with a miut she'eno matzu. Call it 95% of the women out there are not islanders. And therefore the rov is a birur. And if the rov is a birur we saw in the Ramban, there's no need to do any bedikas because the suffix is gone. So from this Gemara, we see the power of rov. Rov could remove the suffix. If it's a rov with a miut she'eno matzui, the suffix is gone. It's completely vitiated. It's completely undermined. There is no suffix. Or in the fancy language of the yeshiva world, there's no leidas hasuffix. There's no beis hasuffix here. That's the power of rov. If that be the case, then Rav Yirmiyah, in support of Ravina, says the following. You want to know whether we could rely on rov to set a standard for ben sora umoreh? I'm going to prove it to you from the case of a bas sholosh shana v'yom echad. I'm going to prove to you a breakthrough shita, and that is that rov has the power to remove the suffix. Wow, if rov has the power to remove the suffix, then we can set up standards for ben sora umoreh, and we can put him to death after 2 months and a third, which is just 1 second. Yeah, we could put him to death based on the fact that rov removes the suffix.
Those are 3 months.
What I meant to say was, we don't have to wait, says Ravina, the full 3 months. I'm sorry.
No, we do.
Yeah, I'm sorry,
Even if it's
sorry.
3 months.
Sorry,
Even if
yes,
it's after 2 and
yeah,
a third.
thanks,
Yeah.
David.
No, but you don't have to
I made a
worry that
mistake in my
you
calculation.
don't have to
Sorry.
worry that it'll be only a 7-month.
Right, we can put him to death.
Even 2 months and
Even
and
beyond
3
2 months and a third, based on the rove. What do you mean? How can we do such a thing? And the answer is we can do such a thing because rove has the potential, if it's the right category of rove, to remove the suffix. So that now we're going to assume that the Ben Soromor, is only royally Karei Av after 3 months. Before 3 months, what are you telling me? Oh, yeah, 5% of the women give birth prematurely. We don't have to worry about those 5%. The Torah establishes that with a rove, with a miyachain of matzui, the suffix is gone. We have a birur of the suffix. This is not a fallback position. We are definite about it. And if the Torah operates with rove, which you and I know is not definite, but the Torah considers it definite, ad kedei kach that we don't even have to lift a finger to check out the shochet or to check out the body of the animal that was shechted. What do you mean? X number of animals were trephos. X number of so-called shoftim are charlatans. And if you don't believe it, well, you can't ask my father because he's gone, but he would tell you about his first Rabbanus, probably a century ago, in Bangor, Maine, and he discovered 2 charlatans where they were doing shechita. So there are people out there like that did it. Of course, they were more powerful than my father, so my father eventually, they forced him to give up the position. And there was another rabbi in the state of Maine, I don't want to mention his name. I have a letter from him to my father that I found after my father's death. And he says, Rabbi Berzon, why did you have to be such a kanoi? When my father knew that they were being machil, klal Yisrael, nevelis, and trephis. And Bangor, Maine at that time, believe it or not, you may have never heard of Bangor, Maine, although there was a guy named Weinberger. He wasn't Jewish. What was he, the Secretary of Defense, whatever? He came from Bangor, Maine. Anyway, but Bangor, Maine at that time was a major center for shechita throughout America. And my father was absolutely convinced that these guys were charlatans. They knew nothing about shechita. My father was a young idealist and he went to fight for Klal Yisrael. He lost the battle, unfortunately. If you ever heard the phrase Treifa Medina about America, when you turn the clock back, today I don't think it could happen. I hope not. Anyway, maybe I'm being naive. But so Rabosai, what we've established here is that Rove is powerful enough to be kovea standards for the Torah, both in the case of Edus, when we establish a standard for all discrepancies of all Edim of one day, and in the case of a Suffolk islandess, we establish standards that there's no suffix whatsoever because the Rove is so powerful. And if we apply those principles to the case of Ben Soromor, then Ravina is absolutely correct. That based on Rove, we will put someone to death and establish that even after 2 months and a third, he still is in the parsha and the candidacy of Skila as a Ben Soromor, because the Rove is so powerful. Whoa. What time is it? Just 1 second. We started at 7:45, correct? Oh, okay. I'll let you go. If there are any questions, please stay on board, stay on Zoom. And I'll wish you all a great week. And thank you. I want to thank Adam. Actually, he was the initiator here. Although I have to tell you the truth, it takes me much more energy, probably 5 times the amount of energy, to deliver a shir on Zoom. But I hope that the energy was worth it. So it's a beautiful sugya. It's a very profound sugya with tremendous repercussions in life and death cases. Have a great week.
Sure, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.